Hi, everyone, and welcome to our chapter on biomes and biodiversity, Chapter 10. This is a really fun chapter where we'll be taking a look at the different types of ecosystems that are distributed over our planet. In this chapter, we will define biome and explain how biomes are related to climate, explain how climate is related to biodiversity of biomes and adaptations of organisms, describe how terrestrial biomes are classified and distributed around the globe, outline abiotic and biotic factors contributing to terrestrial biomes, describe how aquatic biomes are divided by zones, and list types of aquatic organisms, describe how aquatic biomes differ from one another, describe the classification system for conservation status, describe biodiversity and its related terms, and last but not least, identify the benefits of biodiversity to humans. Heading into this chapter, you may already have some sense of what a biome is and even be able to name some specific biomes. But before we can talk about the different biomes, we need to define what a biome is and also talk about the variables that give a biome its particular characteristics. So, biomes are groups of similar ecosystems that cover a large area characterized by a distinct vegetation, soil type, climate, and wildlife. The factor that determines which biome exists in a particular region is the climate of that region. Remember from our climate chapter that climate is defined as the average weather condition over a long period of time, which includes conditions pertaining to temperature, moisture, meaning both precipitation and humidity, air pressure, cloud cover, and wind. So climate dictates the biome. But what determines the climate? Remember again from our climate chapter that climate is brought about by three main factors: insolation, albedo, and greenhouse gases. So, when different biomes have different climates, that means that these regions have variations in these three factors, namely insolation and albedo. And those variations are brought about by the latitude of the region, meaning its distance from the equator, the altitude of the region, meaning its distance above sea level, and a couple other factors play in as well, including proximity to the ocean and proximity relative to mountain ranges. Out of the different aspects of climate that determine a biome, temperature and moisture are the two predominant ones. So, we're going to talk in more detail about these two and the patterns that we see in temperature and moisture levels across the biomes of the world. We'll start with temperature. On Earth, temperature generally falls on a gradient, wherein hotter temperatures are observed at the equator and colder temperatures are observed at the poles. Remember from our climate chapter that this is because the equator gets more concentrated insolation compared to the poles, which receive their sunlight at a more dispersed angle. Based on this temperate gradient, several different zones have been designated based on their latitude. Tropical zones are the most equatorial ones. They're located anywhere between the equator, which is defined as being 0 degrees latitude, up to 23 degrees north, which is a latitude line that we call the Tropic of Cancer, or 23 degrees south, which is called the Tropic of Capricorn. Above and below tropical zones, you'll find temperate zones. These are located between 23 degrees and 67 degrees north and south. So we in Arizona live in what's considered a temperate zone. Then within the temperate zone, there's also a smaller zone that is called the subtropical zone. The subtropical zone is considered part of the temperate zone, but has a generally warmer and drier climate than the rest of the temperate zone. And the subtropical zone is not very well defined in terms of latitude, but it's generally considered to start at 23 to 25 degrees and extend to 35 to 40 degrees north and south. And lastly, Arctic zones include everything from 67 degrees north and south, up or down to the poles. And as we said before, as you advance upward and downward through these zones, temperatures generally tend to get colder the farther away you move from the equator. However, it's not just about latitude. There are other factors that come into play as well. One of these is altitude. So, not only does temperature fall on a gradient from the equator to the poles, it also falls on a gradient from lower altitudes to higher altitudes. Biomes at lower altitudes tend to be warmer, and ones at higher altitudes tend to be colder. This illustration here shows how different biomes tend to be arranged relative to elevation above sea level, with tropical rainforests occurring closest to sea level, followed by temperate forests, then taiga, then tundra, and polar ice at the highest elevation. Proximity to oceans also makes a difference. Coastal regions tend to have less extreme temperatures than landlocked regions of the same latitude and elevation. This is because the water of the ocean moderates the ambient temperatures. It makes winters less cold and summers less hot. So all seasons generally tend to be more mild in nature. So this fills you in on some of the ways that temperature varies across different parts of the Earth. The other major variables besides temperature that determine a biome is moisture. Biomes get classified with one of four different descriptors based on their moisture levels. Arid biomes are the driest, followed by semi arid, then semi humid, then the biomes with the most moisture are considered humid. The moisture level in a particular biome is brought about by several things. Evaporation levels, which are a factor of how much heat the area gets from insolation, the proximity of the region to a body of water, because as we learned about in the water cycle, bodies of liquid water are the source of the water vapor that turns into precipitation. And then global wind patterns also predetermine where moisture versus dry air tends to coalesce. For example, you may remember when we touched on Hadley cells back in our chapter on atmosphere and air pollution. The Hadley cell is a well defined convection cell which takes place between the equator and 30 degrees north and south latitudes. It's brought about by the fact that the regions around the equator get more direct sunlight, and so the ocean there experiences more evaporation, and that warm, moist air rises. And in the process, as it gets higher in the atmosphere, it cools down and condenses and drops its moisture as rainfall. So now the air is dry and it keeps traveling through the atmosphere until it descends in the regions around 30 degrees north and south latitude. And lo and behold, most of the world's major desert biomes are found around 30 degrees north and south because of this influx of dry air and absence of moisture. So 30 degrees north and south tends to be dry because of these Hadley cells. So do the polar regions, but for a different reason. Polar regions are dry because cold air is not capable of holding very much moisture, so there's not sufficient water vapor being carried in the air to bring about high levels of precipitation at the poles. Another variable that affects moisture levels in a biome is the topography of the land, chiefly in areas that flank large mountain ranges. When you have a tall mountain range, it can bring about something called a rain shadow, which is what's being depicted in this illustration. If one side of the mountain range tends to get an influx of humid air, the wind will carry that humid air up the mountain, and as the air travels upward in altitude, it cools off. And we know that when this happens, the moisture condenses out as rainfall or snowfall. So now the air is dry, but it keeps traveling, and by the time it reaches the other side of the mountain, there is no moisture left, or very little, to facilitate precipitation. And this dry region on the opposing side of the mountain is called a rain shadow. And finally, the geography of a region and how far away it is from the coast also plays a role in moisture patterns. The farther inward, the drier it tends to be, because the air has to travel a farther distance from the ocean to reach the area and loses most of its evaporated moisture by the time it gets there. So that gives us a sense of some of the moisture patterns that play into biomes. And when you take these two things together, moisture, and temperature, there are certain trends that are observed in the distribution of biomes across the world in terms of a specific moisture level and specific temperature level, tending to yield a certain biome. So in this figure, we have average annual temperature plotted on the x-axis along the bottom there, and annual precipitation plotted on the y-axis. As you can see, if we look at the highest temperatures on the farthest right side of the graph, there are three different biomes stacked up here, and which one you get depends on the precipitation. The highest precipitation combined with the highest temperature yields a tropical rainforest right here. High temperatures and somewhat low precipitation levels yields tropical seasonal forests or savannas. And then high temperatures with low precipitation in um, in this region provides a subtropical desert. That's where what we are. Looking at slightly lower temperatures, the wettest biomes with mid-range temperatures are temperate forests. Slightly drier than that are temperate seasonal forests. Okay. And then drier than that are woodlands and then shrublands until finally we have temperate grassland, cold deserts. Amongst the coldest biomes are boreal forests and tundras. At the farthest left of the temperature scale, and it's probably no surprise to you that these temperatures and moisture conditions are what determines the type of organisms that can survive in a region, starting from the very most basic level with the plants. Plants play a critical role in the ecosystem because they are the producers. Everything else in the ecosystem relies on them all the way up to the food chain, either directly or indirectly. So, plants are the foundation of a biome. And what type of plants can grow in a biome is related to the biome's growing season. The growing season is the time period each year when it is warm enough for plants to grow. Arctic biomes have a growing season that is only a couple months long because of the remaining portion of the year everything is frozen. Whereas tropical biomes often have a year-round growing season as long as there is enough precipitation to support that kind of activity. Another factor that plays into plant growth is soil nutrition. And Arctic zones have poor nutrient soil because the cold temperatures mean that any organic material in the region decomposes very slowly. So it does not break down quickly and re enter the cycle to support other living organisms. And additionally, there is a very slow rate of primary production in these regions. Interestingly, tropical zones tend to suffer from the same problem. They have nutrient poor soil because it's so warm and wet that organic material decomposes too rapidly, and also because the high levels of precipitation tend to wash away the nutrients that are produced from decomposing organisms. So the organic soil just doesn't build up, and then the minerals and such are washed away and leached. Temperate zones strike a nice middle ground between the shortcomings of Arctic and tropical zones in the terms of soil nutrition. These areas tend to be the most fertile across the globe. That's one of the reasons why in the United States the soil is so rich here. And then the final factor that plays into plant growth is the seasonality of precipitation. Some areas have one rainy season that generates most of the precipitation for the entire year. An example of this is California. The months of December through March, oops, my apologies, account for the vast majority of precipitation that takes place in California. In Arizona, we have the monsoon season in June through September that results in most of our rain. Other places get steady precipitation year round, and this kind of pattern, of course, supports different types of plants that you would find in a biome with limited seasonal rainfall. The New England area of the northeastern US, an example of a place that experiences year-round precipitation. So, in summary, the growing season, nutrition, uh, and precipitation patterns are all a product of a region's climate, and all of these things dictate which plants are able to grow and survive in a particular biome. Because plants are the producers and all the other levels of the food chain are linked to them, either directly or indirectly, the plant life influences the number of variety of different of other organisms that can be supported within a biome, or in other words, the biome's biodiversity. Biodiversity refers to the number of different species and organisms in a biome. Typically, higher biodiversity levels occur in warmer biomes as well as in wetter biomes. Therefore, in line with what we know about the characteristics of the Earth's different regions, biodiversity is highest in tropical zones, especially tropical rainforests, which are warm and wet, and lowest in Arctic zones, which are cold and dry. Whatever the conditions in a biome, the organisms that live there evolve adaptations to those conditions. They'll adapt to the abiotic factors, which include temperature, moisture, growing season, length, and soil quality. For example, as you probably know, many of the plants that are found in the Sonoran Desert have special mechanisms that allow them to store water for long periods of time. Plants in cold regions will show a dormancy cycle when they shed their leaves, and their growth slows considerably during the period between growing seasons. Other plants have adapted to low light conditions or are especially good at pulling nutrients out of poor nutrient soils. And animals exhibit adaptations to these factors too, of course. We'll be talking much more about biodiversity in our final section of this chapter. In our very next section, we will be talking about some of the general trends that we have learned about here and the features of biomes and exploring the different types of terrestrial biomes that we see on our planet in detail.